everyone. Those of you that don't know me, I'm Marina Stanley and I'm the Director of the TAC Secretariat, the Training Accreditation Council Secretariat, for those of you that are not familiar with the acronym. I want to first begin with an acknowledgement of country, and we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Western Australia and their continuing connection to the land, waters and community. We pay our respects to all members of the Aboriginal communities and their cultures, and to elders both past and present. Thank you all for making the time to spend the morning with us today. You've been invited, for those of you that are third parties, you've been invited here today because you are a third party to an RTO and you have a partnership with an RTO, a registered training organisation. And those training organisations are regulated by us, the Training Accreditation Council, the Vocational Education and Training Regulator, or the VET Regulator. Hopefully I've got all the acronyms out of the way. So TAC, the VET Regulator, and RTO, Registered Training Organisation, if you weren't already aware. Now, I might also add that we've got RTO representatives here today, which really is terrific and shows a really great commitment by them supporting you as their third partners, and really that says a lot about their partnerships with you. So I want to also acknowledge those RTOs in the room today. So today we have an opportunity to achieve two main things. Firstly, to provide you with a little bit of an overview of who we are as TAC, our regulatory function in relation to RTOs, and by extension their third parties, and how this involves you as the third party, as the provider of services on their behalf. And secondly, the other main thing we want to achieve today is really an opportunity, and this has already occurred this morning, really an opportunity to network, have a chat amongst yourselves, talk to other third parties, talk to other RTOs in the room, and of course meet some of the TAC Secretariat team today. So any questions you have, you're more than welcome to have a chat with them. So a little bit about TAC. The Council operates within a national VET regulatory framework. And this framework broadly is set within a set of national standards, policies, guidelines, etc., as you would expect. And all those things really aim to achieve national consistency in the way that we regulate the sector, both here in WA and where there are other vet regulators across the country as well. So that essentially we're undertaking a similar function and regulate our providers in a similar way. So for TAC, we regulate those providers that deliver to domestic students only in WA and or in Victoria. There's a national vet regulator, you may have heard of them, the Australian Schools Quality Authority, ASQA. They regulate providers who deliver across states, so not only in WA and Victoria, but will also deliver in other states outside of those two states, and also to international students. So if you're an RTO delivering to international students, or to domestic students across a number of states outside of WA and Victoria, you've got no choice but to be regulated by the National Vet Regulator. So we have two state regulators, WA, that's us TAC, and in Victoria they have the Victorian Registration and Qualifications Authority. So in terms of TAC's governance structure, just quickly, I think it might be useful for you to know how we operate as an independent statutory body, as the state's vet regulator. So we have 7 members of the council, and they are each appointed by the Minister for Education and Training, the Honourable Sue Ellery. Our current chairperson, newly appointed by the Minister, is Anne Driscoll, and some of you may be familiar with or know of Anne. She's the immediate past Director General of the Department of Training and Workforce Development, so we're very lucky to have her. She comes with a wealth, many years of experience, both in regulation and more recently in vet policy matters. And our outgoing chairman, Ian Hill, finished at the end of March after nearly 18 years of service to TAC. So we're very sad to see him go, but also very excited now as a new chapter begins with Anne. The TAC Secretariat itself, so the second arm of, so under the council we obviously have the TAC Secretariat. Somebody's got to do the legwork. We do most of the heavy lifting in terms of all of the work that we need to undertake on behalf of the council in terms of the registration of providers and the accreditation of vet courses as well. And we also provide a lot of support in terms of the state national reform, vet reform agenda, and any other matters that are occurring at a vet policy, particularly vet regulatory matters. So it keeps us very, very busy. The council, if you're not aware, meets formally every month, but they also consider matters out of session on a regular basis as well. And then an extension of us and the council are our external panel of auditors and accreditation reviewers. So they're very experienced. Some of you will have met some of our auditors in particular. And they are appointed through an external tender process. So their main task is to conduct audits on behalf of the council and submit reports on outcomes of those audits, so compliance or non-compliance against a set of national standards. So they do some very important work as well. They also help us develop content for our professional development program. And we rely on them given their the high expertise, high level expertise in the vet area. Auditors, as you can imagine, have quite an ability to really forensically look at documentation and arrive to decisions about compliance against a framework. So they do a very good job for us. And we're very pleased and very proud of the group that we have as well. So the WA government has continued to support us as the state regulator, mainly because it allows the state to have oversight of the regulatory market here in WA, rather than a national body like the national regulator, which really has a national approach and may not have the interests of the state top of mind. So we're able to identify potential risks at a state level, design a program around responding to those risks and advising the government along the way so that there's no surprises. The other thing that's really important at a state level is that it is worth noting that as TAC we regulate almost 90% of the publicly funded student enrolment cohort. So in terms of protecting the state's investment in vet, it's another really important reason why the government has been very supportive of the state regulator. In terms of those risks that I talked about before and identifying those risks, just a quick little side note, if you're interested, we publish a regulatory strategy. We've been publishing that every other year and we're just in the process of developing our next regulatory strategy for the next 2 years. So that document outlines the priorities that TAC or the council has identified as posing risks to the quality of vet in this state. And it also, as I mentioned, outlines the planned regulatory strategies to help monitor and minimise those areas of concern. So if you're interested in having a little bit of a look, you can find that on the TAC website, and we've got details on our website a little bit later on. And you'll notice, if you would like to have a read, you'll notice third-party arrangements is in there as an area of concern. And it's one of the reasons, obviously, we look at a number of different strategies to manage risks. And in terms of the risk that we've identified around third-party arrangements, this event today is part of looking to improve those areas of concern that occur from time to time out there. So just quickly back to tax jurisdiction. If you want to deliver nationally recognised training and issue certification for that training under your name, then you have to be registered as an RTO by a vet regulator. And that's just how the system works, and that's the same across the country. To be registered, you have to meet the requirements of a national set of standards for registered training organisations, and it's the job of the council to monitor compliance against those standards. So the connection to you as third parties is that these standards require RTOs to meet specific requirements in relation to third parties they engage. If you want to deliver nationally recognised training in this country and issue certification for that training under your name, then you have to be a registered training organisation. And to be a registered training organisation, you have to jump through some hoops through a process to be registered with a vet regulator, such as TAC here in WA. And as I mentioned, there are a set of national standards for RTOs, and it's the Council's job to monitor compliance against those standards. And as I said earlier as well, so as a third party, the connection to you here is that these standards require RTOs to meet quite a number of compliance requirements, and the RTOs in the room are nodding their head. There are quite a few compliance requirements under the standards where third parties are involved. And I'm just going to run through a few of those key things to note. And you may have noticed when you signed in this morning, there was what we call a fact sheet on third-party arrangements at the front. So if you didn't already grab one this morning, you're more than welcome to take a copy on your way out today. So much of what I'm going to say today is covered in that fact sheet. And I'll also talk a little bit more about other information and guidance that TAC makes available to you as well. So there's no need to madly write notes while I'm talking. But of course, if you want to, and that's your thing, you're more than welcome to do that too. So the key things to note in terms of the requirements under the standards for RTO is that the standards require RTOs to ensure they comply with the standards at all times, and that's probably an obvious one, including where those services are provided on their behalf. The RTO has to have sufficient strategies and resources to systematically monitor any services delivered on its behalf, and uses these to ensure that the services delivered comply with the standards at all times. Hopefully some of you aren't nodding off already. And that information, whether disseminated directly by the RTO or on its behalf, needs to be accurate and factual, because it's really important that where RTOs have third-party arrangements, that learners are clear about who the RTO is and who the third party is who are acting on the RTO's behalf. Because of course, remember, the third parties aren't the ones issuing the certification, it's the RTO that's issuing the certification. And as stated on the slide there, regardless of who carries out the activities, the RTO is responsible for ensuring they comply with the standards at all times, and as mentioned before. The standards also require RTOs to be clear about where the training and assessment is being delivered on its behalf by a third party. So whether it's on its website or its marketing material, if the RTO has engaged a third party, they need to make it very clear in that marketing material or wherever else it appears when they're looking to recruit new learners. It needs to be very clear that the RTO has outsourced some of its services. And why I mention training and assessment as two aspects of some of those services that they may outsource, training and assessment sometimes are areas where learners are most confused about who's actually going to certify them at the end of that training and assessment. The standards also require that RTO have a complaints policy to manage and respond to allegations about third parties. So if the learner's sitting is with you as a third party and they are dissatisfied with the service or they're unhappy about one of the staff members, then they need to be clear about how they can make a complaint to the RTO about that. And the RTO also, under the standards, needs to have an appeals policy. So if a learner wants to challenge an assessment decision, for example, if the outsourced service is assessment, then they need to know who they can appeal that decision with. The other thing that RTOs need to do under the standards, so it's not just TAC. By the way, the regulators don't write the standards. We don't. We have some input when they are reviewed or there's a new set of standards developed, but the vet system is very much an industry-driven sector, and so industry actually have the biggest say in terms of what they want to see in the standards for RTOs. So as vet regulators, we, as I said earlier, monitor compliance against those standards. The RTO also has to notify TAC when it enters into and finishes an arrangement with a third party, and there are timeframes around that as well. So every time they start an arrangement or they finish an arrangement, they've got to let us know within 30 days of each of those things occurring. We keep a register, by the way, as a vet regulator. We keep a register of those third-party arrangements connected to the RTOs that we regulate. So one of the key requirements, and most of you will be most familiar with this aspect, one of the key requirements under the standards is that RTOs must ensure that any service provided on its behalf is subject to a written agreement. There needs to be a written agreement. It's in the standards that it needs to be a written agreement. It can't just be a handshake or a let's agree to do these things. It needs to be some form of written agreement. The council and vet regulators tend not to, or we don't provide templates for those. All we can do, and none of the regulators do, but what we do is provide some guidance around what those agreements could contain, for example, as an example of good practice, so to speak. So much of that probably sounds like common sense to most of you as experienced business people, particularly in the third party space, and it's obviously important to have a written agreement so that people are clear, so each party are clear about what their roles and responsibilities are and who's doing what under those arrangements. And the other important thing is that a written agreement ensures that it's a mechanism to ensure that as a third party you're not claiming to be the RTO, because under our legislation, the vet legislation, which was on one of the earlier slides, it's actually an offence to what we say purport to be an RTO. So that written agreement safeguards you as a third party in that way. Well, it's one mechanism anyway. The other thing is that the standards require you as third parties to cooperate with us as a vet regulator if we make a request for information or in the conduct of audits. And some of you may have been involved. We undertook a strategic review into third party arrangements last financial year, and some of you have been involved in that process. So there are a lot of reference to third-party arrangements throughout the standards. So this might shed some, or help shed some light on why the RTOs that you're in partnership with are in close and regular, hopefully close and regular contact with you, and they're not just stalking you for no good reason. And I hope also that it makes good business sense. Why wouldn't you have those checks and balances in place? Make clear what those roles and responsibilities are. And at the end of the day, it's the RTO's reputation at stake. So, the written agreement is a key mechanism to ensure that the partnership works for all parties. And clear communication is relevant, not in this case, but of course in everyday life. So this is no different. So the focus on third parties across the standards acknowledges that third parties play a critical role, an important and critical role in the delivery of services on behalf of RTOs. And they are clearly a major contributor to the quality of vet outcomes, and this can't be underestimated. As a third party, you support RTOs deliver services on their behalf, and for the purpose of the standards for RTOs, and I hadn't mentioned this earlier, but the types of third parties included as defined in the standards for RTOs are things like where RTOs outsource training, for example, or they outsource training assessment, or they outsource educational support. So if your learners need some kind of educational or other related support, and also if RTOs are looking to outsource their marketing practices in where they're looking to recruit new learners. But of course, it's important to note that RTOs remain responsible for the outcomes and quality of the services that are provided on its behalf. And as mentioned earlier, the RTO remains responsible for the certification on successful completion of the learners' training. One of the motivations for us inviting you here today was to follow up, and I mentioned earlier, a strategic review into third-party arrangements that we undertook last financial year. Strategic reviews are an opportunity for the council to take a deep dive look into specific areas of concern, and there was quite an exponential growth in third-party arrangements and stakeholder concerns, which prompted the strategic review at that time. The report was published in 2020, and what we found from that review, and I mentioned this talking to a few people earlier this morning, a significant finding of that report was of the 29 RTOs that we audited through that strategic review, they recorded 219 third-party arrangements between them. So their average is 7 agreements per RTO. So that was quite eye-opening. As I said, there is a requirement on RTOs to let us know where they have a third-party arrangement in place. There hopefully less so now, but at times there may be some confusion on the part of the RTO about what constitutes a third party. So in undertaking the third party review, we were able to uncover formal third party arrangements that would fall within the definition of the standards for RTO. So it was quite a surprise to us, and also not a surprise that there were so many third party arrangements in place. And there are many very good reasons why RTOs outsource their services. They'll be looking to expand their operations to more learners and more locations, which is a very common reason why RTOs outsource, particularly if they're metro-based and they're looking to service clients in regional WA. Access to facilities and specialised equipment is another obvious one. Of course, it helps spread the load and also keep up with industry demands and the latest tech, so to speak. Where you're able to outsource and source those specialised facilities and equipment, then that's going to add to quality outcomes. Some RTOs look to outsource the marketing and recruitment of learners, and they're looking for that specialist expertise to help them raise the profile of their provider out there in the community. And also another common one is RTOs will often outsource the educational support type services, which is not a bad thing. If you identify within your RTO that you don't have the expertise to support some learners, then by all means look elsewhere to support those learners. So that's certainly encouraged. So these are all really great reasons to outsource and meet client or learner needs. So the strategic review was really able to let us know and let the community know exactly why and why providers outsource, and we were really pleased with much of what we saw when we were out there. RTOs, as part of the strategic review, they did tell us that one of the main challenges was working out roles and responsibilities with their third party to ensure products and services are delivered as agreed. So the written agreement, any other process that you can put in place to make clear what those roles and responsibilities are really key. So we found that RTOs, the good news is RTOs generally performed really well through those audits that we undertook through that strategic review. We saw high levels of compliance, which was terrific. But there was one area of concern. Almost a quarter of RTOs demonstrated non-compliance in the area of information around refunds to students. So students were saying they weren't clear about if they needed a refund, whether they were to approach the RTO or the third party. So there was some confusion around that, particularly if the third party was no longer and the RTO ceased those arrangements, or the third party failed to deliver the service that was agreed. So that was particularly an area of concern. As part of the review, we surveyed learners, and learners confirmed that audit finding. So the non-compliances certainly lined up to learner feedback in that particular area. There were a number of recommendations from that review, and we have published the report, and it's there on our website if you just search for that if you're interested. And one of the recommendations was that TAC should explore further opportunities to provide education and guidance for third parties on their obligations. So really, as I mentioned earlier, this is an example of how we're extending our information and guidance to support third parties directly. So there has to be a written agreement. The standards say that there has to be a written agreement. There's no way around that. And of course, that agreement really represents that formal contract between the RTO and the third party, detailing all the obligations on both sides. Often the RTO will provide you as a third party with a template or a document to get the ball rolling, but by all means as a third party you can also take an active role in helping to put that document together. So don't be afraid to be part of the process and work with your RTO. They'll, I'm sure, welcome that, welcome your input into that. And I've no doubt that many RTOs are inviting their third parties to be part of that process. Now, the agreement, so I'm just going to list off a few things that we would suggest would be good practice to include in that agreement. And again, the fact sheet does list some of those things, and we've got other guidance available through the TAC website that helps people put some good agreements together. But some suggestions we would say, obviously, some of them will be obvious to you, and some of you will be familiar with some of these things because you will have seen them in those agreements that you have with some of your RTOs. So obviously, specific contacts for information between the parties. A schedule for how you're going to communicate, when you're going to communicate, so that routine contact and or visits between the parties. We also say that the agreement should outline monitoring mechanisms such as arrangements to inspect third-party facilities. You know, the RTO has an obligation to offer training and assessment services, for example, if that's what the third-party arrangement is around, to provide that training and assessment and provide those facilities and equipment that meet a particular industry standard depending on what the training product demands. So it's important, so it would be no surprise, hopefully no surprise to you as a third party, that the RTO would want to come and visit and have a look at those facilities and equipment from time to time. So some kind of monitoring or quality assurance process to ensure that the services comply with the standards. As mentioned, you know, there are a lot of references to third-party arrangements throughout the standards for RTOs, which means that RTOs have a lot to comply with. And with that comes a lot of evidence they have to collect to demonstrate that compliance on the odd occasion where we'll come and visit and have a look and do our audit process. So there'll be good reason why, and sometimes I want to do, RTOs will have their own internal continuous improvement processes, and part of that will extend to third parties to ensure that the third parties are delivering those services to those standards. The agreement should also include a process for dispute resolution, should there be a dispute between the parties. It's like any partnership, we can all be friends in the beginning, but sometimes unfortunately things don't work out and agreements need to end. So it's important that there's some dispute resolution process built in, whatever that looks like, but it's important that there is some reference and people know if things don't work out, this is what we're doing about it. Well, this is the process we're going to follow. Particularly with learners in mind, at the end of the day, those learners signed up with an RTO and will have an expectation that they'll be undertaking training assessment and be certified for that training and assessment. So if the partnership does go sour, then there needs to be mechanisms in place to ensure those learners aren't disadvantaged or impacted by that breakup. In line with the finding that we found in the strategic review around handling of fees, it's really important that the documentation around fees handling or any other documentation that you're handing over to those learners makes very clear who the RTO is and that you're the third party in that arrangement. So when we come out to audit where we know that there's a third party arrangement, we're specifically looking for those things, that it's very clear to, if I was a learner sitting in your classroom or sitting in whatever learning environment you're offering, that it's very clear to those learners who's going to be issuing the certification at the end of the day. And the last thing I might mention is, particularly learners in third party arrangements, they need to know who they can make a complaint to. And so it may be that the third party is the first point of contact, but the learner needs to know that as a third party, you will be forwarding that complaint on to the RTO, because it's the RTO's role to manage the complaint from a student about the services being delivered by you as a third party. So if your agreement with the RTO as a third party is here today don't include some or all of those things at least, then it would be worth you asking or locking in some time with your RTO to just step through the agreements that you do have in place, just to check that it covers off all those things that you would expect to see in a written agreement. And that, of course, as common sense, ensures the best possible outcomes, the best possible working relationship between the two of you. And as mentioned before, much of what I've said today is in our fact sheet, and if you haven't already grabbed a copy, there are copies at the signing desk that you can take on your way out. So in addition to that, we have a range of other helpful fact sheets. We have quite an extensive range of information and guidance material for you to access, completely free of charge, all available via our website. We also offer and do many workshops to support the sector. You don't have to be an RTO to attend our workshops or register for our webinars or contact the Tax Secretariat. If you have any kind of question around VET and RTOs and the standards or whatever it is in the VET regulatory space. So please jump on our website, give us a call, and we can help you through those issues. So after hearing all of this information about the important role you fulfil as a third party, and now that you're aware of the support and guidance that TAC offers, some of you might be thinking, either you can't get your head around what it must take to be an RTO and we've put you off, or some of you might be thinking, actually, we might think about becoming an RTO ourselves in the future. So hopefully, like I said, we haven't put you off entirely. But if you would like to go down that path, please have a chat with any of our team members here today or later call into the office. And we're happy to talk you through some of the application process around becoming an RTO. We've also got a webinar about becoming an RTO. It's a 1-hour webinar, and the next one's scheduled for the 20th of July. Even if you're not looking to become an RTO, it's another way that you can access information to gain an understanding of what the RTO requirements are, as with all of the information that we provide in terms of the regulatory and compliance obligations of RTOs that we provide as well. I really wanted to thank you for your participation this morning, and I really hope that you gained some useful insights and you got to meet some new people and have a chat around your tables either before this morning started or at your tables during breakfast. We'd be really keen on your feedback on today's session, so we're going to be emailing you out a feedback form. So if you can spare a few moments, we'd really love to hear back from you. I just wanted to thank you all again for attending this morning, and have a great day.